The lights at the reception shimmered against the crystal glasses when I felt his presence behind me, colder than the evening air drifting in from the balcony. My stomach tightened before I even turned, as if my body recognized a danger my mind hadn't caught up to yet. The music kept playing, but it sounded distant, warped, like it belonged to someone else's celebration. If you've ever sensed something was deeply wrong before you could name it, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. These moments change us in ways we never forget. I remember studying his face just long enough to see the cracks forming beneath that polished charm, realizing the truth had finally cornered him. That was the moment everything started to unravel. He caught me alone for barely a moment, but it was enough. The reception lights were soft, the music still drifting through the hall, and yet all I could feel was the sharp, cold edge beneath his smile. When he leaned in and hinted that he had plans for my oceanfront home in Wilmington, something inside me snapped into perfect clarity. I had been afraid of this man from the moment I first sensed something off about him. Long before tonight, long before this wedding my daughter believed would change her life. And now, standing there with his intentions laid bare, I realized my instincts had been trying to warn me for months. I'm Megan's mother. I've spent her entire life trying to protect her from the kind of harm she never sees coming. She's always been trusting, hopeful, willing to give people more chances than they deserve. Maybe that's why the fear hit me so hard, because I knew in that instant that whatever he wanted from me tonight was only a shadow of what he planned for her future. But beneath the fear, something steadier rose. I had been preparing for this moment without fully admitting it to myself. The unease, the doubts, the little signs I kept brushing aside. They all came rushing forward as confirmation that I had been right to stay alert. And standing there in the middle of the celebration, I knew I had to go back to the beginning. I had to remember when the first cracks appeared, when the early suspicions started whispering that something about Ryan just didn't fit. The first time I saw Ryan with my daughter, something inside me tightened in a way I couldn't fully explain. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was more like a quiet shift in the air, the kind that makes you turn your head without knowing why. He carried himself with an ease that felt rehearsed, as if every gesture had been practiced in front of a mirror. And yet, Megan looked so alive beside him, her smile brighter than it had been in years, especially after everything she'd survived. I wanted so badly to believe that maybe life was finally giving her a gentler chapter. Still, there were moments, small ones, that didn't sit right with me. The way he always positioned himself in conversations just enough to steer them. The way he seemed overly curious about our finances, or how he brushed past certain questions with a charm that felt a little too polished. Nothing outrageous, nothing I could point to and say, "This is wrong." Just faint red flags that flickered at the edges of my mind. I remember telling myself I was being unfair. That grief can make people suspicious of anyone new who steps into a loved one's life. I tried to soften my thoughts, tried to focus on the way Megan laughed again, how she spoke about the future with the kind of hope I hadn't seen since she was a teenager. For a moment, I even convinced myself I was reading too much into everything, that maybe I was just afraid of losing the small, peaceful world we had rebuilt together. But deep down, beneath all the motherly hope and hesitation, something in me stayed alert. Something watched him closely, even while I smiled and tried to be supportive. And as their relationship began to look more perfect on the surface, that quiet instinct only grew sharper. For a while, it really did look like the kind of love story every mother hopes her child will find. Watching Megan and Ryan together felt almost like witnessing a second sunrise in her life. They slipped into a rhythm so naturally. Morning coffee runs, weekend hikes, quiet dinners at my place where they moved around the kitchen as if they had been doing it for years. Megan glowed in a way I hadn't seen since she was a little girl twirling in our living room. And seeing that light again softened something in me I didn't even realize had grown hard. Ryan played his part well. He remembered small things about her, made thoughtful gestures, and was charming in that low-key way that feels safe. I caught myself exhaling around him, easing into the idea that maybe he truly was who he appeared to be. There were evenings when I watched them tease each other gently across the table, and I felt an unexpected warmth settle over me. I wanted to believe this was real, that life wasn't setting Megan up for another heartbreak. Still, even in the sweetest moments, there was a thin thread inside me that stayed taut. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a quiet awareness, a sense that I should keep my eyes open. But the joy in Megan's face made it easy to tuck those thoughts away. For a brief stretch of time, I let myself drift toward believing that my earlier unease had been nothing more than a mother's worry misfiring. I just didn't realize how quickly that perfect picture would begin to change, or how subtle the first cracks would be when they finally appeared. It happened slowly, almost gently, as if he hoped the changes would slip past unnoticed. But once the wedding plans began, I felt the air around Ryan thicken with something I couldn't quite name. He grew a little sharper around the edges, more guarded when money came up, more distracted when Megan talked about the ceremony, more selective about the moments when he showed affection. None of it was dramatic. Nothing anyone else would have pointed to. Yet each shift felt like a soft tap on my shoulder, reminding me of the instincts I had tried to quiet. Megan, bless her heart, was glowing. She had color in her cheeks again, excitement in her voice every time she showed me a fabric swatch or talked about the guest list. I wanted so much to mirror that joy, but I kept catching glimpses of Ryan watching her with a look that felt calculated, not loving, measured. There were evenings when he'd drift into an odd melancholy, offering vague comments about financial burdens or past disappointments. almost as if he were laying a trail of breadcrumbs. And every time, something in me whispered that I'd seen this pattern before. Just faint outlines, but enough to make my pulse tighten. By then, the tremors beneath the surface were too steady to ignore. I knew I needed to stop hoping my instincts were wrong and start preparing for the possibility they were right. It was time to look deeper, whether I wanted to or not. It reached a point where I simply couldn't quiet my own mind anymore. Every night, as the house settled and the clock edged past 2:30 a.m., I would lie there staring into the dark, replaying every uneasy moment with Ryan, the little inconsistencies, the manufactured vulnerability, the way he always seemed to be studying the room, even when he pretended to relax. I kept trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, that I was letting old fears shape new realities. But intuition has a way of tightening its grip when it knows you're avoiding the truth. The breaking point came during one of those sleepless nights. I realized that if something was wrong and I ignored it, I would never forgive myself. The stakes were too high. Megan's future was too important. So, with a kind of quiet dread, I reached out to someone I had hoped I'd never need. Daniel Rhodes, a man who had helped a close friend of mine years ago when she found herself in a dangerous situation. Meeting him felt surreal. Sitting across from him, hearing my own voice tremble as I laid out my concerns. I felt both foolish and justified all at once. Daniel didn't judge me. He simply listened, assessing the situation with a calm steadiness that made my chest loosen a little. Still, handing over Megan's happiness to an investigation felt like placing her heart on a fault line. The waiting was the worst part. Each day stretched thin, filled with quiet dread and heavy imaginings. I tried to go through the motions, work, errands, conversations with Megan, but there was always a hum under my skin, a sense that everything I feared was inching closer to the surface. Then, one evening, Daniel called and asked to meet again. His voice held a seriousness I hadn't heard before. And in that moment, I knew the truth he'd found was going to change everything. When Daniel asked to meet again, I already felt the answer forming in my chest. There was a heaviness in his voice that told me whatever he'd found wasn't something a mother could swallow easily. Still, nothing could have prepared me for the weight of what he laid before me that afternoon. I remember sitting there, feeling the room tilt slightly as he told me that Ryan wasn't even Ryan. The man my daughter planned to marry had been using a false identity for years. His real name carried a trail of lawsuits, vanished bank accounts, and families left shattered after trusting him with their savings. He had spent years drifting from state to state, hiding behind carefully crafted stories and collecting victims the way most people collect memories. But the worst blow came when Daniel hesitated, just for a moment, before revealing the part that broke me open. Ryan was married, legally, to a woman named Lila, a woman who had once believed in him just as fully as Megan did now. A woman who had been pulled into his schemes without even realizing it until it was too late. Hearing her name, hearing how deeply he had betrayed her too, made something inside me split between fury and grief. I felt sick with guilt. How had I missed this? How had I let this man get so close to my daughter? All the little signs I ignored came rushing back like accusations. But beneath the shame, another feeling rose, harder, sharper, steadier, determination. If Megan had been spared from marrying him, it wouldn't be by accident. It would be because I stepped in. That's when I realized I couldn't do this alone. Lila wasn't just another victim. She was the one person who understood exactly what we were dealing with. Reaching out to her was terrifying, but it felt necessary, like opening a door I'd been avoiding. And in the days that followed, as the wedding week approached, the shape of a plan began to form, one that would finally bring his lies to light. The week leading up to the wedding felt unreal, as if I were moving through two separate lives at once. The shock of what Daniel uncovered still pulsed under my skin, but it quickly hardened into purpose. I reached out to Lila with a trembling kind of resolve, unsure of how she would react, yet knowing I couldn't do any of this without her. When she responded with quiet exhaustion and a strength that mirrored my own, something shifted. We were no longer strangers connected by betrayal. We were allies bound by the same man's lies. Together, we pieced through documents, timelines, bank trails, and photographs. I remember sitting at my kitchen table late at night, arranging everything into a clear sequence, imagining how each piece would expose him. Lila worked in tandem from her small apartment, sending me details that filled the gaps I didn't even know existed. It was a strange kind of partnership, built on pain but anchored in determination. During the days, I forced myself to smile through dress fittings and cake tastings, pretending everything was normal while my mind rehearsed every step of the plan. Megan's joy made my heart ache, and every time she hugged me, I felt the weight of the truth pressing harder against my ribs. I kept telling myself that protecting her meant carrying this burden alone, at least until the moment came. As the wedding day approached, the tension tightened like a wire inside me. I knew exactly when and where the truth would surface. And by the time the reception arrived, I was ready for everything to finally break open. The music at the reception drifted through the room in soft waves, the kind that should have made me feel proud and sentimental. Instead, I felt a sharp pull in my stomach the moment Ryan motioned for me to follow him toward a quiet corner near the back of the hall. Even before I reached him, I sensed the shift in his energy. His smile was stretched too tight, his eyes calculating, and the pressure in his voice carried an edge meant to corner me. He leaned in just enough for me to feel trapped, laying out what sounded like an expectation, a warning, and a demand all tangled together. For a moment, that familiar dread rose in my throat, the same dread I had felt for months. But this time, I didn't let it rule me. I steadied myself, reminding my own heart that I hadn't walked into this room empty-handed. I watched his confidence flicker as I held his gaze longer than he expected, and when I stepped slightly to the side, revealing Lila standing just a breath behind me, everything inside him shattered. The color drained from his face so fast it almost startled me. His posture collapsed in on itself, as though someone had knocked the wind from him. I could see him calculating, scrambling, searching for a way out that no longer existed. The celebration around us continued. Laughter, clinking glasses, music rising and falling. Yet in that small corner, the truth settled like a stone on the floor between us. I felt an unexpected calm take over. Not joy, not triumph, just the steady certainty that the moment I'd planned for had finally arrived. And as his panic grew, I knew the fallout would reach far beyond him. It would hit Megan next, and nothing would ever be the same. When the truth finally reached Megan, it didn't land all at once. I watched it move across her face slowly, starting as a tiny flicker of confusion before widening into a kind of disbelief that made her look younger, almost fragile. And then it hit her in full. Her shoulders collapsed, her breath caught, and her eyes filled with a pain so sharp I felt it in my own chest. In that instant, every part of me ached to pull her close, to shield her from the wreckage. Yet I knew she needed a moment to understand what had been done to her. Around us, the room shifted into a stunned stillness. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. Music kept playing, but it suddenly felt distant, almost hollow. People stared, whispering in uncertain ripples, trying to grasp what they had just witnessed. I felt a heavy wave of guilt rise in me. Guilt that I had been right. Guilt that knowing the truth didn't save her from breaking anyway. I took a slow breath, grounding myself in the reality that this pain, as brutal as it was, also marked the beginning of something necessary. The first tear in the veil. The first step toward accountability, healing, and finally taking back control. And as Megan stood trembling in that stunned silence, I knew the next chapter, justice and aftermath, was already beginning to unfold. The moment his mask finally slipped, everything moved quickly. Security stepped in before he could spin another excuse, and I watched him being led out of the reception hall, his posture collapsing under the weight of what he could no longer control. The celebration around us had dissolved into stunned murmurs, but in the midst of it, Lila stood steady beside me. She didn't need to say anything. The look in her eyes confirmed every detail we would need to hand over to the authorities. And together, we began assembling the final pieces of evidence before the shock had even settled. Megan was shaking when I reached her. She kept staring at the empty doorway where he had disappeared, as if trying to understand how the future she imagined could vanish in a single evening. I wrapped my arm around her, feeling the tremor in her breath. knowing she was trying to hold herself together. And beneath my heartbreak for her, there was a quiet, undeniable relief. She had escaped something far darker than she realized. Later, when the guests drifted away and the music finally faded, Lila and I moved through the last steps, organizing files, signing statements, ensuring nothing slipped through the cracks. It wasn't triumph. It was necessity, a way to make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. As I stood in the quiet that followed, watching my daughter surrounded by the few people who loved her most, I felt the first fragile sense that healing might be possible. And that sense carried me into the reflection that would come next.